Acolytes, and welcome back to my channel. Now, I did miss my March reading journal, but I did both March and April in one video. So you're getting a nice extra long, but not actually that extra long video, because I'm doing something a little bit different. I figured maybe I should do most of my decorating and stuff off screen and just do the reviews and like walk you through the updates of where I am instead of having these really long, more casual videos. So I'm gonna start with March here. If you want to go ahead and skip straight to the reviews, you can check them out right here at this timestamp, or you can check them out in the chapters of the videos. I always do chapters on my videos. For March of this year, I decided to do a like chamomile tea theme, which is maybe a bit niche, but when you're doing as many reading journal themes as I am, niche is better, right? So here's my collage page. This is the reading tracker page. As we can see, I actually read quite a lot in March. I read 9 books: Never Lie, Tremors in the Blood, Last One at the Wedding, Black Sheep, The Drowning Woman, Sister Maiden Monster, The Night Guest, Gory Details, and Look Closer. And you might recognize that some of those titles are on my book clubs list. Never Lie and Gory Details were both part of book clubs that I was attending or was supposed to attend. You may notice also that I read those books but did not attend the book clubs. I'm really bad at going to meetings, okay? I mean, partially because some of them are at like 7 o'clock and that's when I'm having dinner. And also partially just because I'm very shy. But I do read the books, I promise. Part of the reason I'm even in book clubs is to get recommendations on what to read. So I didn't have a lot on my TBR this month. I did have some books coming in from the library, so that was nice. So they went on my TBR, as well as obviously some of the book club books. And one of the arcs that I got from NetGalley, I actually finished that this month in May. So that is The Wrong Daughter by Dandy Smith. Should be getting a review on that one very, very soon. For the most part, I was finishing books in about a day because I read a lot of audiobooks this month. But as you can see, there's one book I was reading for basically the entire month, and that was Gory Details. That book is basically a lot of short scientific articles all together in one book, and so it took me quite a while to read that, but it was really enjoyable actually. So go ahead into the reviews and then we'll come back for the stats for the month of March. Welcome to the reviews portion of the video. Just to let you know, I will be going into some spoilers for some of these books. I do my best to try and keep my reviews spoiler-free, especially if I think it's a book you should read. However, if you are somebody who doesn't appreciate spoilers, I will play this sound and this will appear on screen anytime I'm about to give some spoilers, and it'll disappear when the spoiler section is over, so you can go ahead and skip through that. Never Lie by Frieda McFadden. I was super surprised by how much I liked Never Lie. I read The Locked Door at the end of 2023 and found myself very unimpressed. And I judgmentally labeled McFadden as an author I probably wouldn't want to read again. My feeling about books have evolved since then, and these days I'm willing to give authors a few chances before they end up on my no list. Never Lie is a story told in both the past and in the present. Trisha and Ethan are newlyweds going to tour a remote house in the countryside to consider making it their starter home. But while visiting, the couple gets snowed in and are forced to spend a few days in the abandoned house. The previous owner was an extremely successful psychologist named Adrienne Hale, who took clients in her home and disappeared under mysterious circumstances. I will say this is not some great piece of literature with compelling themes and deep characters. This is a fun, fast-paced, twisty thriller, the kind of paperback that you read on a plane or by the pool. To that end, the writing can feel a little amateurish and repetitive at times, especially when we're in Trisha's perspective. However, the novel has excellent pacing that had me absolutely flying through the chapters. I was in a bit of a reading slump from February, and this snapped me right out of it with the way the author breadcrumbed the mystery. Using the tapes as a framing device for the narrative in the past is a great way to move between the two and keep the reader in the exciting parts of the story. I was definitely more interested in the chapters from Adrienne's perspective, as the chapters from Trisha's perspective became repetitive quite quickly. Trisha is a character that's more in her own head because she's nervous for a multitude of reasons. She's creeped out by being in the house of a woman who disappeared, and she thinks there's someone hiding out in the abandoned building. It ends up that a lot of her story early on is that Trisha sees or hears something creepy, she panics and runs for her husband, he checks it out and doesn't find anything, then he gaslights her about it. Ethan was definitely getting on my nerves with the amount of gaslighting he did towards Trisha. Thankfully, their story does pick up in the third act, and it becomes quite the conspiracy. Adrian's story is good enough to keep the plot moving. She commits a small crime at the beginning of her story that allows one of her clients to start blackmailing her with a video of her committing that crime. Her new book was about to release, and seeing a #1 best-selling author and respected psychologist engaging in vandalism would ruin her reputation and her book release. From there, the story spirals completely out of control. There are disappearances, multiple murders, and suspects galore. For a while, I was hesitant to get engaged in the story because I thought the twist was extremely obvious. I was ready to be disappointed, but I found myself surprised by a few of the twists. The patient blackmailing Adrian has the initials EJ, and he's an attractive blonde man. It just so happens that Trisha's new husband is a blonde man named Ethan. There are quite a few other traits they have in common, like a narcissistic personality and dismissive nature. I was sure that the twist was going to be that Ethan was Adrian's killer, but there were way more twists than I was anticipating. That doesn't mean that Ethan wasn't somehow involved in this massive tangled narrative, though. So much information that's given throughout the book ends up being more important than it seems, and I found that really interesting. There were small anecdotes and conversations that I thought were just used to flavor the world that became a much more central part of the mystery. I will say that I'm not sure if the twists hold up upon a second read. I'm sure the major ones do, but I think there's some character inconsistencies with Trisha specifically. I liked some of the characters, again mostly in the Adrian story. I liked her, and I 100% believe that she is an autistic woman. I love that representation. Adrian was smart and manipulative, but also quite human, and I think it was a good thing that she was a morally gray character. I also really liked Luke as a love interest. He was so sweet and courteous to Adrian, and his respect for her space and her way of living was very endearing. I was kind of secretly hoping that he and Adrian had run away together and lived happily ever after, but unfortunately this isn't that kind of story. Again, this book is not perfect by any stretch. The atmosphere was definitely lacking. The writing feels very utilitarian, telling you only what you need to know, and sometimes even things it's already told you a few times before. I think if you're willing to suspend your brain and enjoy the ride, Never Lie is a fun way to kill a few hours. I gave Never Lie 3.5 stars. Tremors in the Blood by Amit Katwala. This is a non-fiction book about the creation of the polygraph, aka the lie detector test. There are 3 main characters in this story. John Larson, a new-to-the-beat cop who has some interesting scientific background that might be able to lead to some crime investigative breakthroughs. Gus Vollmer, a police chief with a great reputation and a desire to continue making his city a better place to live, and Leonard Keeler, a really ambitious but kind of off-the-rails young man. They all have their part to play in the development of the polygraph test, and they all have different opinions on its efficacy and how it should be used in crime scene investigations. I wish I had better things to say about Tremors in the Blood. The topic itself is super fascinating, and I was excited to read this book for my nonfiction book club. And while the information seems very in-depth and credible, the delivery of that information was quite dry and quite boring. It's difficult for me to call nonfiction books boring because I want to be cautious that I'm not just in a fiction mood in reading a nonfiction book. However, I seriously considered DNFing Tremors in the Blood at multiple points. I only pushed through because I'm a massive completionist. The first 60% does an excellent job at introducing the people involved with the invention and describing the events that led to the introduction of the first polygraph device. I was especially interested in the idea that the guy who literally invented the machine believed as far back as the very beginning of the story that the polygraph should not be used as a lie detector. With how ubiquitous the polygraph machine is in our criminal justice system and entertainment, I thought that the information regarding the accuracy of the machine was more modern. It makes me a little angry at our justice system for using it for so long when the inventor himself held a hatred for what he'd created. The friendship to business relationship to rivalry of the 2 primary inventors, Keeler and Larson, was definitely a point of interest at first, but unfortunately the rivalry was not that interesting. It mainly consisted of both men bitching to an intermediary, Vollmer, about each other. And I know the author can't change what actually happened, but that doesn't mean it was fun to read for like 60 pages. I don't really have a lot to say about Tremors in the Blood. It was a well-researched history, but if you're interested in simply the invention and early usage of the machine, you can probably stop reading around the halfway point and have a pretty good idea. I gave Tremors in the Blood 2 stars. The Last One at the Wedding by Jason Rekulak.
Frank is a kind of lonely man. His wife is dead and his daughter is estranged from him. But one day he receives a shocking call from his daughter, Maggie, for the first time in 3 years. She invites him to her upcoming wedding in New Hampshire to the very rich, very mysterious Aidan Gardner, the son of a famous tech billionaire. Frank feels very out of place, and he's trying his best just to reconnect with Maggie and not cause her any embarrassment. But some things about the wedding are unusual, and he has a hard time letting it go. When Frank finds out that a young woman went previously missing and Aidan Gardner was a suspect, he is even more determined to figure out what's going on to keep his daughter safe. I have the least amount of strong feelings about this book that I possibly could have. There is a certain horror here that I think is very compelling, and it's a horror that's been explored in many other books, which is the horror of conformity. Frank is understandably put off by some of the tasks he's expected to do at the wedding, like signing a long NDA without reading it. His sister and the guard at the gate are pressuring him to sign it without reading it to not make a scene, but Frank is obviously in the right here. He understands that this is weird, and it's not a good idea to sign something without reading it, but he eventually folds to the pressure. It's a theme that persists with other characters as well. Characters who know that something is wrong, but they go along with it to avoid causing a scene. Frank is a bit of a confusing character to me. At the beginning of the story, he comes across as a very paternal figure who's goofy and kind and would do anything for his daughter. But that image conflicts with how he treats the foster daughter that his sister has taken in. His sister brings the foster daughter along to the wedding because she's sort of an emergency placement case and has nowhere else to go. Frank is immediately embarrassed by this. He finds it like cringe, I guess. He's snappy and rude, and his internal monologue refers to the girl as being ugly multiple times. This is a little girl. She's like 10 years old. Again, he's also extremely embarrassed of this little girl, even though she's polite, well-behaved, intelligent, and the other guests like her. It made me like Frank a lot less than I did at the beginning of the story. The incident with the chicken breast in particular was so weird. So the little foster girl, she's like loading her plate up with too much food, and she drops a chicken breast on the ground, and Frank picks it up, puts it on his plate, and eats it. Frank would rather eat a chicken breast that the little girl dropped on the ground rather than apologetically call over a caterer to get it cleaned up. That's weirdo behavior. Kids drop stuff, adults drop stuff. You know, you don't have to eat food off the ground. And this was outside. It wasn't like in a restaurant. Not that that would make it any better, but he straight up ate chicken that had been in the grass. It's not that big a deal to waste one singular chicken cutlet and make this poor little girl feel so bad about it. Just weirdo behavior. The rest of the story is what I can only describe as fine. The writing was fine, the atmosphere was fine, the mystery was a little by the books, if I'm honest. If you're a regular thriller reader, I don't think any of these twists will end up too shocking, but they're executed well enough that I still found the book enjoyable. I agree with many other reviewers that the ending felt like it dragged a bit. I didn't mind seeing where all of the characters ended up, but as soon as we left the wedding location, the plot points became a bit bogged down. It felt like an epilogue that just dragged on for way too long, or maybe there was a climax at the wedding and then there was a secondary climax after the wedding, which is a really weird way to structure a book. I don't know. I really like Maggie, Frank's daughter's characterization. She's a kind of cunning and self-centered character, and I like that the way she treated Frank showed that character. I actually would have liked to see much more of Maggie. She's very central to the mystery, but she spent a lot of the story off-page preparing for the wedding. I don't necessarily feel like her twists or personality came out of nowhere, but I would have liked more examples of her being her true self before the big reveal. The last one at the wedding was a perfectly serviceable thriller. I've had Hidden Pictures on my bookshelf for ages, and I've just never really felt like picking it up. But now that I have another Jason Rekulak, sorry, his name is hard for me. Now that I have another Jason Rekulak book under my belt, I might just pick it up. I would recommend this book if you enjoy an anxious character who is right about feeling anxious. And rich people being assholes, of course. I gave The Last One at the Wedding 3 stars. Black Sheep by Rachel Harrison. Vesper left home at 18 and never looked back. Mostly because she's not allowed to come back after leaving her hyper-religious community. But then a mysterious red envelope arrives on her bed. Inside is an invitation to the wedding of Vesper's cousin, Rosie. It seems like Vesper's being given an exception to the no returns rule. It wouldn't be the first time that Vesper's been given special treatment by the other members of her community. Vesper decides she has to go to the wedding, at the very least to make Rosie feel awkward about marrying Vesper's ex-boyfriend. But when she arrives, mysteries and a terrifying secret are revealed. I ended up really liking Black Sheep. The tone is, it's very similar to a kind of lame but greatly beloved cult classic horror movie, and this was definitely intentional. I would guess that the author has quite the love for this genre of horror movie. Constance, the mother of the main character, was a very famous scream queen in a bunch of horror movies, from like slashers to ghost stories. And I wondered while reading if each mention of a movie villain, plot, or prop was a reference to a real series. It gave the book a bit of a self-awareness in some of the cheesier moments, but I still sincerely enjoyed it. I wouldn't say that the surprises necessarily caught me off guard. What her family's religion did surprise me a little bit. I definitely thought they were Mormons for the longest time, but no, they're spoilers, they're Satanists. I'll give the book a pass on not being accurate to the real religion because, again, I firmly believe that this novel is a reference to the era of the Satanic Panic and the horror movies that came from that. Once the religion was revealed, I do think it was obvious as to where the twists involving Vesper were going. However, I wasn't put off at knowing the twist before Vesper because she doesn't believe in her religion. No one in real life would think, I've never met my dad because he's actually Santa Claus, and be taken seriously. It's only obvious to the reader because this is a story. I wouldn't say that this is the most horrifying book ever, but there were some creepy moments. When Vesper's powers are starting to get a little out of control and she intentionally hurts some of the normal people in her life, I was a little disturbed by some of the description. My tolerance for horror is pretty high, but anything involving teeth gives me the shivers. It's a bit of a slow start, but I like books about cults, so that part kept me entertained until we started to get into the more supernatural parts of the story. I liked the way the other cult members treated Vesper, and the explanation for that treatment. At times it felt like Rosie was a total doormat towards Vesper, but it made sense in relation to Vesper's role in the cult. It was the same around her aunt and ex-boyfriend. For some reason, everyone around Vesper wants to make her content, and it leads Vesper to being an interesting character. She's not spoiled exactly, but she does prioritize her needs above others. She has relatively low empathy and will hurt her friends and family just because. However, Vesper does feel guilt after being rude and entitled, and her internal monologue often involves her arguing with and scolding herself for being so mean for no reason. She is quick to apologize when she sees she's hurt others. It makes for a well-done internal conflict between Vesper's nihilistic, angry side and her hope that humanity can be better. The ending is big, bold, and dramatic, and I really liked it. Again, it's totally a final girl climax from an 80s horror movie, but it was exciting. I liked the choice that Vesper made about her future, and how it tied into the themes of generational trauma. She has to acknowledge that she has her own power outside of what power her family has allowed her to have, and utilize it to break free from her planned destiny. Vesper chooses to entirely give up her family, which is not a choice she was willing to make at the beginning of the story. She had theoretically given up her family, but a part of her deep down wasn't ready to let them go. In the epilogue, it's shown that she's finally accepted herself. The writing was light and breezy, with some good descriptions here and there, especially in relation to the horror elements. I think the pacing dragged a little bit in the middle. Vesper essentially leaves the cult again for a few chapters, and then goes back again. I understand why. She needed to be shown that she can't just bury her feelings and go numb again. Vesper actually needs to confront her trauma and move forward. I get it, but I do think it felt a little bumpy pacing-wise. I enjoyed the pleasant atmosphere of the cult with the dark secret underneath, almost like a Stepford Wives atmosphere. I would recommend Black Sheep if you enjoy camp, because it was campy, but in all the best ways. If you enjoy a cult, this one might also be for you. It was a short read, but I was hooked, so if that sounds good to you, definitely give it a try. I gave Black Sheep 4 stars. The Drowning Woman by Robyn Harding. Lee Gulliver is homeless and living in her car out on the streets after her restaurant failed and she fell deep into debt. While sleeping in her car in a secluded spot in Seattle, she sees a sobbing woman throw herself into the ocean. Lee dives in and rescues the woman, but instead of appreciation, she's met with fury. The drowning woman, Hazel, tells her that she wanted to die, and she's trapped in a toxic, abusive marriage. The two grow closer and closer, and one day, Hazel asks Lee to help her disappear. But Hazel might be hiding some secrets of her own. So much happened in this book, it felt like nothing was happening, and then everything was happening, and I was just being pulled along for the ride. I liked Lee as a character. Despite being homeless, she still has hope for herself and her future. I wouldn't call her optimistic, but it's obvious that she's looking for a better life. Lee is also smart and resourceful, and she barely thinks twice before diving into the ocean to save a stranger. I was genuinely happy for her when her kindness towards Hazel was rewarded with a more consistent source of food and small gifts. Lee also starts dating an attractive man who gives her a more consistent place to shower and sleep at night. Everything is looking up. Kind of. It turns out Hazel isn't exactly who she seems, and neither is Lee's new boyfriend, Jesse. The way these characters all tie together and the plot against each other is incredibly intricate, and the book really picks up in the second half. I was a little put off though because we switched to following Hazel for the second half of the novel. I'd gotten attached to Lee and her perspective, so it did feel a little jarring to have her basically removed from the latter half of the book. Hazel is a little less defined as a character as well. In the first half of the book, in Lee's perspective, Hazel is putting on a front for everyone. She seems to drop her guard a little around Lee, but when we read from her perspective, we find out that she hasn't been being honest with anyone. Because we enter Hazel's perspective as the plot is ramping up, there isn't as much time for the reader to get to know her. I'm not sure if I would describe Hazel as smart, or kind, or determined. Maybe desperate, but that's all we really understand from her character. She does seem to have a bit of a conscience, at least. I didn't really see any of the twists coming, but I do believe they were all relatively textually supported. I would be interested to go back and check. I was a little bit tuned out of this book for a lot of it. I don't know. There are murders and attempted murders and conspiracies to commit murder all stacked on top of each other, and it was exciting, but also maybe a bit unsteadying. Like, I hardly had time to process the last twist before we're reading the next one. There was also a bit of winding and unwinding and winding that happened when it came to Hazel's husband. I didn't mind the fact that he was a powerful man, but I don't necessarily buy that he would be released from prison. Or was he released from prison? The author actually twisted and untwisted this thread so many times that I literally can't remember what happened with him at the end. I enjoyed the ending. It was the kind of ending that I was hoping for. I'm glad it didn't end more tragically, because these women have definitely been through enough. I thought the writing was well done, and the building tension worked to create the atmosphere. The pacing dragged at times and flew at others, but not really in a way that felt balanced. It maybe needed a bit more tightening up. I would recommend The Drowning Woman if domestic thrillers are your thing. I think you'd really enjoy the soap opera level of reveals. I would give a trigger warning for suicidal thoughts and suicide attempts, though, so please be cautious if you're sensitive to that topic. I gave The Drowning Woman 3 stars. Sister, Maiden, Monster by Lucy A. Snyder. If you like weird books, Sister, Maiden, Monster is an absolute treasure trove. As someone who is a lover of the weird and wonderful, this was exactly up my alley. Sister, Maiden, Monster is a story about the end of the world, and it follows 3 different protagonists in 3 parts that describes this coming apocalypse. The first woman is Erin. Her story opens with her in a facility recovering from this mysterious disease that began spreading through the population and leaving some of its victims with permanent effects. Erin was quite unlucky, as her bout of the disease interrupted the night her boyfriend proposed, and left her a Type 3. Type 1s escape the illness with seemingly no lingering side effects. Type 2s end up enjoying the taste of blood, but Type 3s develop a taste for human brains. Erin must be isolated from everyone around her, especially other people who have been infected, and is tracked by the government to ensure compliance. However, she begins to develop a secret relationship with a Type 2, behind her fiancé's back and away from the government's prying eyes. Savannah is a sex worker in a brothel. In the world of Sister, Maiden, Monster, sex work is legal and heavily regulated by the government to avoid the spread of the contagion. When one of her clients visits her, but isn't himself, Savannah is forced to defend herself with lethal force. Fortunately for her, it's a massive turn-on. And she knows she'll kill again to satisfy herself and the higher beings that call to her. Mariva has maybe the biggest role to play in the coming Armageddon. Her whole life she's been plagued by teratomas, tumors that contain partially developed eyes, teeth, and hair. She's always had these tumors removed before they can grow too large, but the Eldritch Masters might have a use for her strange affliction. I had such a blast with this book. It's weird. I was definitely a little horrified and grossed out the whole time, but I also couldn't stop reading. My main issues with the book were in regards to its pacing and its themes. The pacing is a little easier to explain, so I'll start there. Each character gets their own part, and while they all appear in each other's parts, we don't get back inside their head. Everything also keeps moving forward, which I think is a good idea. If each character's perspective went back to the start of the outbreak, it would feel extremely repetitive. The weakest section, in my opinion, is Savannah's. I like that the Eldritch beings are altering humanity, playing on our pleasure receptors. First with our pleasure in regards to food, and then with Savannah with sexual pleasure. The main issue with Savannah's section is that the author has to use her as a bridge from the first outbreak section to full-on chaos, and there is a lot of work to do to get there. Savannah also has a higher purpose that she's been informed of, but the reader isn't, so through much of Savannah's section, the audience has very little idea of what her motivations are beyond pleasure seeking. I also don't really remember Savannah's section that well, which is a bit of a problem because that's where the apocalypse stuff starts happening. Then we switch to Mariva's point of view, and right as the apocalypse really begins outside, she's whisked away to a secluded space where she's safe and comfortable. In a way, I feel a little cheated. The rest of the story had been building to this coming pandemonium, and I was excited to see hell break loose. I wanted to watch the chaos going down, but instead we're pulled away from the action for Mariva's story. It's not that her story wasn't good, it's just it sucked some of the building tension out of the climax. With Erin's section, the pacing was also quite off. It started really well, giving the reader an idea of what her world was like before, during, and after being infected, but the end of the section really goes downhill. Erin is starting to lose a little bit of grip on her self-control and sanity, but I would have expected a slower descent. Mariva actually worked with Erin, and in her perspective, Erin seemed to be on the decline for weeks. From Erin's point of view, her descent seemed to happen almost immediately in a single chapter. I would have liked to see a bit of a slower decline. So much emphasis is also placed on the relationship between Erin and her new girlfriend, and unfortunately she doesn't factor very much into the end of Erin's section, or really the rest of the novel. None of these are horrendous crimes, but all put together it feels a little bit like stumbling down the stairs. Clumsy, but with a lot of momentum. I still had an excellent time, and I was never bored because on every page some new insane development was happening. Believe it or not, there are actually some really great themes at play too. I'm gonna get a little bit into spoilers, but I don't think it's anything that'll ruin the reading experience for you if you decide you'd like to. The primary theme is about a woman's right to choose, specifically about pregnancy, childbirth, and abortion. The first murmuring of this theme begins in Erin's section. The disease genetically modifies the body so that anyone who has been infected and becomes pregnant will produce rapidly multiplying tumors in their uterus instead of a fetus. Because of this, all infected women are advised to get an IUD to prevent pregnancy, and Erin supposes aloud that the men are probably being recommended vasectomies. The worker looks blankly at her, asking why they would do that. It ties into the idea that the women are responsible for not getting themselves pregnant, while men are often absolved of the responsibility. Many men in relationships will pressure their partner into going on the pill or having an IUD inserted simply so they don't have to wear a condom. The idea of a fetus growing as a tumor instead of a child is also an interesting sentiment. It's not necessarily that children are tumors. I would say it's more along the lines of, if you don't want a child and you're pregnant, it can feel like there's a malignant tumor growing inside of you. The theme of pregnancy and childbirth is especially prevalent in Mariva's story. I don't want to spoil it too much because her entire section is an abortion or sterilization metaphor. I actually think these themes are very well done. Some of the best horror has a point to make, and using the imagery of things that disgust us is a great way to get the audience to think further on the ideas that are presented. Some of my issues lie within the secondary themes that aren't as explored. There's an idea of government overreach, and though this ties partially into the reproductive rights themes, i.e. Texas trying to prevent pregnant women from traveling out of state, some of these ideas were a little flyby. Corporate greed was another theme that was touched on in a paragraph and never mentioned again. In the midst of the crisis, companies were being bought by larger companies and then stripped for parts, and Congress refused to do anything about it because a few members had stock in these larger companies and were getting very rich. That's not too far off of what's happening in the United States basically ever, but it's not all that relevant to the story at hand. There was also a very strong, opinionated ending to the reproductive rights theme, but not these other themes. I liked the ending and what the author had to say about the reproductive rights theme. I think that the others were confused, that the author was trying to shove a few too many points into their story. I'm also not sure if there were some religious themes I was missing. The cleaving was especially strange to me. I have no idea what happened. I have no idea why that happened, except maybe to add some weirdness to a bit of a drier section. Maybe it had something to do with, like, love? I don't know. It's interesting to think about. I like that we got a bit of an explanation for where the initial virus came from, and I liked that there was a bit of a hint about it in Erin's story. I do think the section explaining it was a bit long and dry, but I've read so many cosmic horror books that don't explain a thing. This was a bit of a refreshing change of pace. Having the scientist YouTube channel as a through line was a good idea. It allowed the author to drop little pieces of information and exposition without having to spell it all out in the prose. I really enjoyed Sister Maiden Monster, though I'm sure you wouldn't be able to tell by my face while I was reading. There was so much to talk about. I kind of want to force my boyfriend to read it, my husband now. I kind of want to force my husband to read it, so we can have a long, in-depth discussion about it, though I think he might end up too traumatized to speak. I think it's a flawed book, but I would recommend it if you have a reasonably strong stomach. It is gross at times though, so grab a hazmat suit and then dive in. I gave Sister Maiden Monster 2.5 stars, but I give it 5 stars on how badly I want to do a book club of this book and talk about it with everybody. This book is crazy. The Night Guest by Hildur Knutsdottir. Idun is in another doctor's office. She is so fatigued all the time and she knows something isn't right. But most doctors dismiss her symptoms and blood tests haven't revealed any cause. Some of her friends suggest that she should try getting her 10,000 steps per day, so she buys a step counter and keeps up with her steps. One night though, she accidentally falls asleep with the watch on and wakes up to find she's walked over 40,000 steps in one night. Something strange is happening while she sleeps, and it is the cause of her weird fatigue. I am gonna say, right from the jump, that I think listening to this as an audiobook is not the intended way for this story to be told, and in doing so, I lost a lot of the atmosphere and the pacing that the author was trying to build. I think if you have the chance, you should read this as a physical copy or an ebook. It's nothing against the narrator. The narrator did an excellent job, and I know I would have skipped over the names a lot if it wasn't for her narration, but seriously, you should read this as an ebook or a physical copy and not an audiobook. Despite the book being around 200 pages long, the audiobook is only just about 3 hours long. This is because the author utilizes the blank space of the book as much as the words to build the atmosphere and explain the character's state of mind. There are multiple chapters that are only a sentence or two long, and I would say the majority of the chapters are less than 2 pages long. Unfortunately, I didn't really feel the impact of this because I didn't actually read the book. There's also a chapter where the author is just spelling out a very long list of names, and I imagine it would have been more effective if I could have seen these names laid out instead of just hearing them. I do feel a little cheated by the experience I got. The story itself has a great hook and a really intriguing premise. However, this book is very ambiguous about providing answers. I think that it's not necessarily wrong, but I do find it a bit frustrating. I got to the end of the story and my first thought was, I have no idea what really happened here. I guess I'll have to look it up later. And I did so, and it seems like no one else has any idea what really happened either. I like ambiguous horror in some ways. It opens an avenue for communication with other readers, and sometimes the unanswered questions can be debated for decades to come. However, I do still think the authors of ambiguous horror need to make an impactful climax, and I just didn't feel the impact of this climax at all. I think part of the reason why this book didn't connect with me tied in with the information we were given about Idun's sister. She haunts the story, but her relationship with Idun and her life outside of Idun are quite vague. I know that Idun says she loved her sister, but she also seemed to be jealous of her life and success before she died. It also seems like Idun might have slotted herself into her sister's life after her death, though the reasons for that are not fully explained. Idun might have done it partially for her family, partially because she was jealous, or maybe because her sister was still around spiritually. The relationship Idun has with one of her sister's old boyfriend could be her simply wanting to become her more successful sister, or it could be her sister working through Idun's subconscious. The sister is the crux of the mystery, but we don't really know in what way. Idun describes slipping something under her sister's pillow when she was alive, but it's never described what that something was or what it was for. It's possible that through some ritual, Idun bound herself and her sister together because she never wanted to be apart from her. It's possible that Idun's sister returned as a vengeful ghost because her sister was taking over her life. It's possible that Idun is simply going insane and her sister may have suffered from the same mental health issues before she took her own life. I wouldn't mind this ambiguity if the actual moment of impact and reveal had felt more complete. There's also some compelling themes in this book about the experience of being a woman. Idun is dismissed by older male doctors when she speaks with them about her fatigue, mirroring the way that medical gaslighting is a very real thing women go through. She only starts to have someone on her side when she sees a female doctor. Iduin's friends are this catty group of women who like each other but always feel in competition with each other as well. Iduin has also just broken up with a man who was her married co-worker for being abusive towards her, and he doesn't want to go quietly. It just feels like everything in the world is piling on top of Iduin at once, and her knight persona might be the answer, even if it's a violent one. If you go on Goodreads, a lot of reviews are about the cats, so I feel like I should talk about it. Yes, there are animal deaths in this book, specifically the death of a number of cats. It is shocking, and it's understandable if people are put off by that. I'm not the biggest fan of animal death as a plot element, but I do think it can be done well and effectively. I'm just not sure if I would describe this as effective. It definitely impacted me emotionally, and it was a horrifying thing to read, but this is a horror book. I just wish I could see stronger ties between what Iduin was doing to the cats and the rest of the story. I did see a review that say that she killed the cats because she has violence towards what she can't have, and she's allergic to cats, so she can't have a cat, so she has violence towards cats. I don't hate this explanation, but also Iduin has been living with the cats in the neighborhood for years without having this snap, so what changed? There's also the potential that the cats were part of some ritual to strengthen the spirit of the sister inside Iduin, but I don't think it was described well enough for me to say definitively. I think I remember the cats being described as being hung in a spiraling pattern, but there was no other sign that this was a ritualistic sacrifice. There is something creepy and interesting in The Night Guest, but I think you have to work hard to find it under the layers of sleep deprivation, psychosis, and cat death. The writing is good, and it works well with the plot of descending into madness. I would definitely want to read another book by this author. I just don't think she nailed the ending. I would recommend The Night Guest if you don't mind a book that's a bit of a puzzle, and if you have a strong tolerance for violence against the cute and furry. I gave The Night Guest 2 stars. Gory Details by Erika Engelhaupt. Erika Engelhaupt is a science reporter, and she investigates the gross, strange, and morbid absurdities of our bodies and our universe. I quite enjoyed Gory Details, though it did take me almost a full month to finish. I don't really recommend sitting down and reading this book cover to cover. I enjoyed it more by picking up the book whenever I felt the urge to read something gross and going through a story or two. A few of them do lead into each other, but they're all separate enough that it wouldn't feel choppy. The author of Gory Details is a science writer who doesn't just write about the gross, gory, and bizarre, she interacts with it in person. And I think that's really what elevated this book for me. Anyone can go online, read a few articles, even do an interview or two, but Engelhaupt put her money where her mouth is, quite literally in some cases. She attended a bug tasting party and viewed corpse decomposition, and in doing so can describe more than just the facts. With every story, she provides a sensory experience and an emotional one. The author is a human too, so she does have the same grossed out reactions most people would have to a room full of maggots. But she approaches with curiosity, and by the end of each visit develops an appreciation for the topic at hand. There were a few chapters where Engelhaupt didn't have any personal involvement in the topic, and these were definitely weaker in comparison. I know not everything she discussed can have a physical, tourable area, but those were the instances where I was feeling a little more disengaged. A few of the chapters also felt very short. I suppose I would rather the author be precise and only say what's necessary, but I felt like a few of the stories ended right as they were becoming interesting. As for how gross the book actually is, I think most people would rate this between a 6 and an 8 on the disturbing scale. Personally, as someone who is interested in horror, both fictionally and non-fictionally, I would describe it as more interesting than disgusting. The way the information is presented leads with an approachable tone, so by the time we're elbow deep in muck, I am laughing along. The author's humor and voice kept even the darkest information light. If you want a personal note, the 2 chapters on cockroaches were the absolute worst. I have a huge fear, probably more of a phobia, of cockroaches, and now I know more about them than I ever could have wanted. Ew! But also now I can traumatize my friends and family with fun facts about how doctors remove roaches that are stuck in your ears. Yes, really, they can climb in your ears. Disgusting. I would recommend Gory Details if you've got a sturdy stomach and a natural curiosity. Keep an open mind and take breaks if you need them. I gave Gory Details 4 stars. Look Closer by David Ellis. Simon and Vicky seem like a totally normal, wealthy Chicago couple, but absolutely nothing is what it seems. It took me a while to actually get into Look Closer, but I do think it ended up being a pretty good, twisty domestic thriller. The audiobook was well done, and I think listening to it as an audiobook helped keep me from being bored when the pacing dragged in some places. This is one of the longest thrillers I've ever read, and I do think a little bit of the fat could have been trimmed. Look Closer is about Simon and Vicky, a happy, successful couple on the surface, but upon a closer look, it's kind of a knot of lies and fakeness. It's difficult to explain how the whole story falls into place without spoilers, and I think it's it's worth keeping the major twists unspoiled. I'll do my best. Simon is a law professor who is up for tenure against a narcissistic nepo baby. His life is completely derailed when one day he sees an old fling, Lauren, return to his town, and he can't stop obsessing over her. Vicky is on her own mission to secure her access to Simon's $20 million trust fund. There was a stipulation that Vicky couldn't access it until she and Simon had been married for 10 years, and their anniversary is fast approaching. She enlists the help of a high-flying investor, Christian, to secure her future. Basically, everyone in this story is lying to each other, and they're also lying directly to the reader. I think all the twists in turn make sense with the earlier sections of the book, but I will say that basically every single thing we learned in the first half of the story isn't true. It's engaging enough, but only just. I think the author probably could have lightened up some of the setup to progress the story more quickly towards the exciting parts. Simon's tenure doesn't really matter, aside from some character building, but I think we get enough of that through the rest of the story. And Christian has a friend who becomes a bit of a threat, but I honestly think he could have been cut too. He contributes in small ways, but he's actually primarily just a vehicle for someone to reveal the full details of their scheme. Not naming any names, okay? The mystery is good, and it takes place across a few murders that take place nearly a decade apart. It's very compelling to see how the plans each character were scheming towards unfolded. I do enjoy a villains win ending, and I actually think that would describe this perfectly. The best way I can actually compare it is to a heist movie. The guys doing the heisting are very often not good guys, and I don't believe that anyone in this story is a true good guy. They all have strong motivators though: money, love, revenge. I enjoyed Vicky as a character more than Simon. I didn't really get his words thing, and I found it annoying more often than not. When Simon is nervous, he'll question the English language. Why does a nose run? Why can you not have a little nice old lady instead of a nice little old lady? It just felt a bit pointless. Vicky kept her personality a little closer to her chest, but I liked her tenacity and her viciousness. Her backstory also really surprised me and made me like her even more. The writing was well done too, but I wouldn't say the book sucked me in, unfortunately. If you're interested in a real head-scratcher of a mystery, I would recommend Look Closer. Just beware it might take a little bit of getting into. I gave Look Closer 3 stars.
Welcome back to me in the past, in the present, wherever I am. Here's our stats page for the month. As you can see, I read 9 books, and the page count was totaled up to 2,930 pages, which is quite high for total pages read, but the average is pretty similar / lower than my usual at 325 pages on average. For our genre breakdown, I read, this is going to be slightly off from the actual numbers because sometimes if I feel like a book fits in 2 categories, I'll put it in 2 categories. So I read 4 thrillers, 3 horrors, 1 fantasy, and 2 nonfiction, because Gory Details and Tremors in the Blood were both nonfiction. For the formatting, I read 5 audiobooks, which is why I read so much this month. Whenever I have a big reading month, you can pretty much be guaranteed that I was reading a lot of audiobooks. I read 1 physical book. Which book was that? My guys, I fear I may have lied to you. This says I read 1 physical book, but looking at these, I don't think I own any of these books. Turns out I'm a giant liar. 5 audiobooks and 4 ebooks. I lied. Ignore that. I don't know why one of them says physical. I must have screwed up somewhere in my tracking. This should be 5 audiobooks and 4 ebooks. I didn't read any physical books this month. Wow. And as far as where I got them from, I got 6 of my books from the library and 2 of them were borrowed. So that's from like friends and, you know, that kind of thing. As for, I'm hiding what the theme is on the other page so you can't see. The best of the month was Black Sheep by Rachel Harrison with 4 stars. And unfortunately, my worst of the month was Tremors in the Blood by Amit Katwala at 2 stars. My ratings breakdown for this month was pretty good. I didn't have any 5 stars, but I also didn't have any 1 stars. I had 2 2-star books, 3 3-star books, and 3 4-star books. So good breakdown. That'll be it for the month of March. Let's go ahead and move on to the month of April. Ready for the reveal? Whabam! I did a photography theme for April. Let me zoom in so you can get a nice close look at this collage. I actually think this one's really nice. I think this is one of my favorite collages I've done so far this year. I feel like all of the Polaroids kind of make it look really nice together. For my April reading tracker, you can see that I did not read as many books in April. I only read 5 books in April compared to the 9 in March, and those were the 1, Helpmeet, This Thing Between Us, Guillotine, and Ring Shout. There was just quite a few days in April where I wasn't reading at all. Also, ignore the fact that this title is so bad. I don't know how I did the stamp so far off. It's terrible. It's truly awful. As for book clubs, I actually got a little bit ahead of the curve by reading The Last One at the Wedding last month in March, but I didn't end up reading any of these other books. I'm trying really hard this year to blast a bunch of books off of my TBR before adding too many more. And I think I've read something like maybe like 16 books off of my TBR so far. So I told myself I wasn't gonna add anything new until I had read 30 books off of my TBR this year. So hopefully we're getting close and I can start book shopping again. Part of the reason I think I read so little this month is I did not have a plan. I only had 3 books on my TBR for this whole month. And that is The One, Guillotine, and Ring Shout. I had all 3 of these books on hold at the library, which is why they were on my TBR. I obviously have a much longer TBR that has like something like 120 books on it right now, but I try to take 6 or 7 every month that I set aside for that month's TBR. And this month I just wasn't really feeling like reading, so I actually didn't do a lot of reading. So I will go ahead and send you into the review section for April. This should be a lot shorter than the last one.
Welcome to the April reviews. The rules still apply from the beginning, but I'll save them again just in case you only want to read my reviews from April, in case you're some kind of freak, in case you're some kind of weirdo. I will do my best not to get into spoilers, but if I'm going to say any spoilers, you will hear this sound, and this will appear on the screen. And when the spoiler section is over, I will play the sound again and the image will be removed from the screen, so you should just be able to skip through any spoilers you don't want to hear. The One by John Mars. Match Your DNA is a company with an amazing premise. With a simple DNA test, you can find the person who is biologically the most suited to be your partner. Millions of people around the world have been matched, but the discovery does have its downsides. Test results have led to the breakup of countless relationships and upending the traditional ideas of dating, romance, and love. Now, 5 very different people have received the notification that they've been matched, and they're each about to meet their one true love. But happily ever after isn't guaranteed for everyone. The One has such a fun premise, and I think it did a fairly good job on delivering on that premise. I think the author really did take a serious look at his premise and think about all the ways it could go extremely wrong or extremely right. And that deeper thought about the world is really demonstrated in how natural the DNA matching system feels in the book. There are dating apps for people who haven't been matched, and match-themed romance trips, and match TV shows, and so much more. This world has adapted to their new normal, and I think that's the most important part about writing a near-future sci-fi. My main complaint with the novel is actually I think there were one too many couples that the story follows. There are 5 point of view characters, and if I had to choose one to get rid of, it would have been the girl whose match was in Australia, Jade. She finds out that her DNA match, Kevin, is dying of cancer. She doesn't feel the biological spark that others do towards their matches with him, and there turns out to be a reason why. I just think her story is a little bit too similar to another character's, and I think the author could have used this time to flesh out the other characters a little more, because at times some of them seem a little flat. Mandy is a divorced woman who recently applied to find her match, but upon discovering who he is, she learns that he's actually dead. She's incredibly depressed to know that she'll never find her one true love, and in a desperate bid to be closer to her match, she becomes deeply involved with his family. I liked the twists and turns in Mandy's story. It played out a little bit more like a domestic thriller, but I would say that the POV switching killed a lot of the tension in her story. It could have been a creeping, escalating sense of danger, but every time the atmosphere started to sink in, we were on to another chapter. Christopher is a serial killer with a mission to kill 30 women, just for the challenge of it. He signed up to Match Your DNA with no intentions of settling down and dating his match, but when he discovers he's paired with a police officer, his challenge becomes a lot more exciting. Christopher is one of my favorite POVs in the book. His progression as a character through the feelings he has for his match is very interesting to witness, and I actually liked the 2 of them as a couple. I think the ending of their story shows exactly why they were matched with each other, as the police officer has quite the dark side herself. The murders get a little repetitive, but they're not really what his story is about, surprisingly. The author knows this, often starting Christopher's chapters with a bit of a time skip. Nick is engaged, but his fiancée insists that the 2 of them take the test, just to be completely sure that they're meant for each other. When Nick's results come back, they're quite the shock. Nick's match is a man. He always thought he was completely heterosexual, and he's never been attracted to a man before, so Nick's fiancé insists on them going to meet this mystery match man. The chemistry is instant, and Nick is forced to reevaluate all of his feelings around love and lust. This was a Bit of a weird one. I think it's really easy to like Nick and his match together, and it's really easy to dislike Nick's fiance. She's the one who pushed the test, she's the one who pushed Nick to meet his match, and then she gets hurt. I think there should have been a little bit more gray area in who was to blame. Nick does things that are unethical, but it's a little bit hand-waved away by the narrative so that Nick and his match can have a happy ending. I think it would have been more effective if it wasn't so easy for Nick in the end. I'm talking around it a little bit because I'm trying not to spoil, but what I'm trying to say is that Nick ultimately loses agency because all of his decisions suddenly have easy answers. Ellie is the scientist who discovered that DNA matches exist, and she's the founder of Match Your DNA, but she's never had a match in her own system before now. She's a reclusive billionaire who struggles with the pain that her discovery has brought. When she's finally matched with a kind, down-to-earth man, she begins to open up and embrace the world a little more. This is also a really good POV. Ellie is a billionaire, and like all billionaires, she's done some highly unethical things to get there. Her match seems like a nice enough guy, but little things start going wrong and make her question him. I liked where this story went, and I liked the mystery elements that some of the other POVs were lacking. I do wish that the climax had gone down just a little bit differently though. Again, I'm going to try and talk around it, but I wish that the live stream hadn't happened. If the secrets behind Match Your DNA had remained hidden, I think it would have created a little more of a lasting impact. It would have made Ellie a stronger character, and it would have created a sense of dramatic irony. I think the way it played out was fine, but a little unbelievable as well. I don't know, I understand why it ended the way it did, but I kind of wish it ended a little differently. The writing was fairly well done, though it did take me quite a long time to remember who each of the characters were, and like what their names were, and what their stories were, which was a little surprising, considering I listened to the audiobook. And it was a high production audiobook. They had distinct actors for each POV, so that should have helped me in distinguishing them. I can't imagine how difficult it would have been if I had actually read the book in print. I think the main issue is just like everybody is British. And so a few of the girls sounded very similar to me. I liked the one. It gets a lot of praise for being a great near-future sci-fi thriller, and I believe that praise is well-deserved. Each story unfolded with surprising revelations and twists, and each one ends in a pretty satisfying way. I think you'll like the one if you watched and liked Black Mirror, or if you wish there was a soulmate out there for you. I gave the one 4.5 stars. Helpmeet by Naben Ruthnum. It's 1900 and Louise Wilk is taking her dying husband from Manhattan to an upstate orchard estate where he grew up. Dr. Edward Wilk is wasting away from a mysterious affliction acquired in a strange encounter, but Louise soon realizes that her husband's worsening condition may not be a disease at all, but a transformative phase of existence that will draw her in as much more than a witness. I wanted to like Helpmeet more than I did. I'd heard very positive things about this novella. I've heard it recommended tons of times, and I've been interested in getting into more short horror stories. So when I saw it was available at my library, I was very excited to pick it up. This book is very short, it's less than 100 pages, and I managed to finish it in one sitting. I think it's a difficult critique to say this should have been longer, because I know how long the story was when I picked it up. Novellas like this give me a little bit of pause, because often the premise is very good, and the lack of further exploration is the point. But it doesn't necessarily change the fact that there is a distinct lack of emotional depth. Helpmeet is about a couple, Louise and Edward Wilk. Edward has been afflicted with a mysterious disease that is causing him to literally fall apart, but no doctor has been able to diagnose or treat him. He and Louise have instead begun planning for his death. Edward, however, has a deathbed confession to Louise about what may have caused his disease. The writing in this book, especially when the characters are speaking or when Edward is telling a story, is very dense. I don't necessarily mind it when it comes to Edward, because it does give the reader an idea of his character, and when we have so few pages to work with, any bit of characterization is going to be a good thing. It did at times make my eyes glaze over a bit though. The characters are surprisingly well written for how little time they are given. Edward is a bit of a narcissist who is unfaithful and a liar towards his wife, who is nothing but doting. Louise is a woman who is so obsessed with the idea of Edward that she's willing to put aside all the ways in which he hurt her and not only care for him in his time of need, but continue to love him. She's an odd character. I would have expected this story to turn into something like a revenge fantasy. The weary wife finally arrives at agency through the husband's agency withering away, but Louise is strangely loyal to the end. I suppose the ending, in which she and Edward get closer than ever, so to speak, could be a commentary on this. Now, she can watch his every move and even control him to a certain extent, but to my understanding, they both have control in this situation, to the point where their consciousnesses are one. I'm trying my best to speak around the events without spoiling too much because I do actually believe the book is worth the time to read it. It would take you maybe an hour. It's interesting reading other reviews for Helpmeet too. Some people are completely disgusted by the descriptions and some are relatively unaffected. I think I fall into the latter category. I might have scrunched my nose up once or twice, but none of the gore made me sick to my stomach, and none of it had really stuck with me in the months since I've read the novella. I should try to come up with like a grossness scale to give readers a better idea, but I would compare this to like John Carpenter's The Thing in terms of body horror, at the very least the movie. I do think it was well described and visceral, and I liked seeing that in a horror book, so points for that. The ending is something. I don't really think that Helpmeet stuck the landing. There was a much more simple story here about the consequences of infidelity. I would have argued that symbolically Edward is rotting away because of the secrets and lies he's keeping from Louise. The falsehoods are literally melting him away, eroding not only his character but his body. Instead, there's something growing inside of Edward. This shifts the metaphor a bit to an area that's more obfuscated. Is it about pregnancy? They are a childless couple, so I suppose it could be. Is it about a new, worse person emerging from the old, like how some people completely change after marriage? It's difficult to say. I don't really understand Louise's motivations for the ending, even though I do think it was kind of cool. I like the descriptions of what happened to her and her body, and I liked the epilogue a bit, where Louise and Edward continue their lives after the event. I just don't really understand the more cosmic horror elements leading up to it. If you read the book, you'll know what I'm talking about, and I would actually love to hear your opinions. Again, I wish I liked Helpmeet more than I did. In hindsight, it wasn't a bad book, but I did leave it feeling underwhelmed and frustrated with the ending. I would recommend it if you have a decent tolerance for body horror and a free afternoon, if only so I can have some people to discuss this book with. I gave Helpmeet 2 stars. This Thing Between Us by Gus Moreno. Vera and Tiago buy a smart home speaker called an Itza, and immediately regret it. Cold spots start appearing around their house, and scratching comes from the walls. And peculiar packages start showing up at the house, but who's ordering them? It was funny and strange right up until Vera was killed, and Tiago's world becomes unbearable. Politicians are looking to turn his wife's death into a symbol for their agendas. And friends and family are kind of smothering Tiago, so he decides to get away from Chicago and move out to Colorado. But there is no escape from his own grief. Sometimes I'll review a book very shortly after I've read it, but I generally prefer to let the book sit in my memory for a little while after reading. It lets me really sort through my feelings about everything before I write a review, but sometimes I come across a book like This Thing Between Us. Unfortunately, I almost feel like I can't give a full review of this novella because I found it incredibly forgettable. I'm usually pretty good with themes and plots and twists and turns, and I have a pretty solid memory when it comes to characters as well, but I remember almost nothing from This Thing Between Us except how it made me feel. Despite what the description may have you believe, the Itza is not very important. It's actually a very small part of the story. There's a lot in the book, but I don't think any of it is covered in a way I found particularly unique. For example, Vera's killer is an undocumented immigrant, and it starts a culture war, essentially with Vera as this innocent martyr. Tiago stays out of it, so it doesn't really get resolved or create meaningful commentary. There's some commentary about race and heritage and internalized racism. Both Vera and Tiago are Mexican, but Tiago is very disconnected from his culture. He barely speaks Spanish, and after Vera is killed, he develops a dislike for Latino people because her killer was Latino. This, however, also doesn't lead to anything. He doesn't learn to love and embrace his heritage, and his heritage doesn't really have anything to do with what's haunting him, or the solution to his haunting. Tiago moves away to gain some space from everyone and everything in his life. He feels a strong desire to disconnect from others and also feels like his is the only grief, outside of Vera's family, that is real instead of performative. It paints a bit of an interesting picture of Tiago as a character. Why does he feel like he's the only one who is properly grieving his wife? Why does he feel like memorial Instagram posts are purely for attention? I think it may be because he idolizes the connection he had to Vera as more special than anyone else's, and he still feels like he has that very real link with her. Things kind of go downhill a little bit after this point. The plot feels like it's suddenly jerked from this relatively tame exploration of grief into a much more literal horror novel. A mysterious obelisk appears in the woods, and it seems to have some kind of power that makes Tiago hallucinate. There's a power at play that is reanimating the dead, and there's a void thing that can suck people into it. See, this is where the book loses me. I don't remember what was happening. I don't remember it having anything to do with the main plot, and I don't remember feeling literally any emotion about it. The ending was a bit sad. I don't actually think that Tiago's lineage was cursed. I think that it was an excuse he gave himself to blame all of this weird, bad supernatural stuff on. I think he was just unlucky, but his belief in the curse only led to more tragedy. I don't know what these supernatural elements were or why they were targeting Tiago specifically. It could have been tied to that older Mexican woman placing a curse on their apartment, but if that's the case, why did the curse follow Tiago to Colorado? I understand the commentary about gentrification, but then the curse should stay in the apartment. It just doesn't make any sense to me. There's also a dead dog in this book. Sorry. Actually, they kill the dog twice, which is kind of funny. Sorry. It's actually not funny, but it is kind of funny that they're like, oh, it's a dog killed. Oh, it's a dog killed. Anyway, I didn't really like this thing between us. It was slow-ish, but by the time the pacing picked up, it felt incongruous with the tone the novella had already built. The writing was well done, and there was some tension and atmosphere to speak of, but the lack of memorability is really what killed it for me. I would recommend it if you're okay being pulled along for the ride without much explanation. If you're someone who doesn't like ambiguity, I don't think this is the book for you. I gave this thing between us 2.5 stars. Isn't that funny? I gave Sister Maiden Monster a 2.5, and I thought that was way better than this book. Maybe I should up Sister Maiden Monster to a 3. It was just so much more interesting. I had such a better time reading it. Alright, we're posthumously upgrading Sister Maiden Monster to a 3 stars. Guillotine by Delilah S. Dawson. Des is just about to graduate from her university with a fashion degree, but she desperately needs a way to get her foot in the door of the luxury fashion design world. She sees an opportunity through Patrick Ruskin, a douchebag who fairly forcefully gave her his number at a bar some months ago. His mother is the editor-in-chief of a huge fashion magazine, and an introduction might just be enough for Des to finally live out her dreams. Patrick invites her to his family's remote island, but the vibes are definitely off. The pink-adorned staff are weird and brisk, and the family is cold and intimidating. The Ruskins clearly have their secrets, but so do the staff. I don't really think Guillotine is high literature, and it's not trying to be. It's a fun, easy read that I enjoyed. It has its problems, but none so bad that it ruined my experience reading, and there's enough good to leave a pretty positive review. I like this kind of story. Des is a very smart, driven, and talented woman who rightfully believes that without nepotism, she may never get to enter the world of couture. She's willing to put up with Patrick even though he's an awful misogynist to live that dream. It gives her character really powerful motivations, so when she's faced with strange or uncomfortable situations on the island, you really understand why she would put up with it for the sake of her future. When things kick off, she's resourceful and clever, and she understands the staff in a way that the Ruskins can't, which is very interesting considering she's only known them for a fraction of the time that the family has. It's a pretty obvious commentary on class solidarity. I don't think Guillotine is trying to be subtle about its themes at all. It's called Guillotine, but I don't believe that the themes or commentary have to be subtle to be effective. The Ruskins are a bit of an interesting development of this concept, though. In many of these Eat the Rich stories, family is everything, but in Guillotine, perfect family is everything, which I believe is probably a more realistic representation of this kind of family. In other iterations of this idea, there would be like the stoner or the rebel, but the Ruskins absolutely do not accept this level of imperfection within their family unit. They value strength, power, and masculinity above loyalty, and I like this subversion on the typical rich family trope. The writing was well done, easy to read, and the book is extremely fast-paced. There were no dull moments once the action really got started, and before then, the atmosphere was very tense and uncomfortable. The blurb compares Guillotine to both Ready or Not and The Menu, and I think it's much more like the former in terms of tone. The deaths are well described and over the top in a way that is entertaining. Honestly, this might be a bit obscure, but they reminded me of the executions in Danganronpa, especially the way that Bill was killed. I reference Danganronpa so often in, in my reviews. I should honestly just do a playthrough on the channel for anybody that hasn't seen it. This is actually where I have some issues though. It was fun to read about the executions and they were gory, intense, and deserved. However, the book becomes very choppy and a bit repetitive at this point. Des runs away with Patrick, they come across a trapped family member, the staff explains what the family member did, the family member is killed in a gruesome way, Des runs away with Patrick, and repeat. There isn't very much character building that's happening, there aren't really any twists or turns, and the story plays out exactly how you'd expect it to. It didn't really affect my enjoyment of the story, but it was definitely a factor in it losing, a star. The staff are very interesting as characters, though we don't get to learn very much about them aside from what they do as a collective and the stories they tell before they kill the family members. It makes them feel a bit like a disposable blob. Whenever we need someone for a themed execution, there they are, and whenever they're not needed, they're not. I don't know if this is intentional. I could make an argument either way. Either this is just the author using characters conveniently, or it's a commentary about how the staff don't really have identities beyond their use to and their connection to the family. Take your pick. It's the latter if you're feeling generous. I didn't really care all that much about Dez's past, though I understand why the author had to include it, I suppose. If Dez didn't have something special about her, then she wouldn't have been allowed on the island in the first place. I think the author knew that the readers wouldn't really care about this because Dez also actively doesn't care about it. It just feels a little out of nowhere, and then it's brought up by Marie near the end of the novel, and it's just meh. I just felt very meh about it. I liked Guillotine a lot. It was a fun, gory, bloody romp through killing people who absolutely deserved it. I would describe it as Saw in book form with a sprinkling of class consciousness on top. I would recommend it if you're down for an easy read where rich people get splattered, which you know I always am. I gave Guillotine 4 stars. Ring Shout by Djeli Clark. In 1915, a movie called The Birth of a Nation cast a spell across America, causing a surge in racism and hatred towards black people and swelling the Ku Klux Klan's rank. Maurice Bourdeaux and her fellow resistance fighters kill Ku Kluxes, awful monsters that hide in the bodies of Klan members. But a bigger evil is brewing, and Maurice can see it coming in her dreams. I had Ring Shout on hold at my library for like 8 full months, so when it finally became available, I was very excited to read it. I had heard really good things, and the premise was very intriguing. So, Maurice Bourdeaux is a resistance fighter who kills Ku Kluxes, a breed of monsters hidden in the skin of white racist humans. They feed off of hate and grow stronger with the growth of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s America. Maurice wields a dark sword infused with the pain and suffering of the souls of her ancestors to slay these beasts, along with her friends. But she has her secrets. Her dreams show a new threat about to emerge in the city, and it may be a force that overwhelms their resistance. The plot of this book is actually quite difficult to describe in a lot of ways because even though this is a fairly short book, there is so much packed into it. It's strange. I do feel like the world was fairly well explained, but at the same time I feel quite lost. I do wonder if this is an intentional feeling that the author wanted to create in white readers. I'm not a part of this culture at all. So as such, I'm just gonna be a little lost. I don't think that's a terrible thing, and again, most of the important lore is explained. The process of creating a Ku Klux, the way Maurice's sword work, and the doctor are all described in detail. The idea of a haint was a little bit confusing for me. As far as I'm aware, it might be like kind of equivalent to like a yokai in Japanese folklore. I've just never heard the word before. And some of the language was also a little confusing for me. The book is written in like Maurice's voice, and as such she uses some terminology that like I wasn't very familiar with. For a while I was actually wondering if Sadie was Asian instead of black, because she was referred to a couple times as Yella and was never really physically described. So I was like, is this like 1920s way of saying that she's an Asian woman? But no, she's definitely black. I thought maybe it was a comment on like intersectionality and how, you know, the Ku Klux Klan was hurting all races, but Sadie's definitely black. The old woman as well, she spoke in a very heavy dialect, and I actually couldn't understand it at times. Sometimes what she was saying was explained afterwards, but sometimes it wasn't. Again, this is likely just me being ignorant of the culture, but it did impact my reading experience a little bit, and I do want to be honest about that. Maurice as a character was well fleshed out, well developed. She's an excellent vessel for telling a story about hate because she has every reason to hate the Ku Kluxes. And further, she has every reason to hate white people. She's lost her entire family because of them, and she has to risk her life constantly to simply stop the spread of this hate, not even reverse it. Her sword is interesting as well, because it's specifically forged to punish other black people, the kings or chiefs who sold their own people into slavery before becoming slaves themselves. Her entire life revolves around hatred, and yet she has the option to not fight in the name of hatred. I liked the other characters as well. Sadie was spunky and fun, and Chef was a good grounding presence too. Some of the characters felt a little superfluous, but I think they were primarily harmed by the novel being as short as it was. Maurice's love interest was incredibly irrelevant to the story. I'm not sure he even said a sentence to her for the entire novella. The Jewish woman also wasn't very relevant. I can appreciate her character as a continuation of the themes of Christian white nationalism attempting to destroy anything in its way. Even though she's white, she's not white enough because of her Jewish heritage. However, I'm not sure her commentary on socialism really goes anywhere. It's brought up basically every time she is, and yet it's not really brought to any conclusion. The body horror and the horror in general is great. I really like the way the Butcher was described. He's horrifying and terrifying, and he's an interesting antagonist for Maurice. He's more of a cerebral enemy for a majority of the story. He's not physically threatening or intimidating Maurice, and yet his ability to neutralize her sword is a great threat. Maurice is also bound by the social chains of her being a black woman and him being a white man. Even if he doesn't physically threaten her, he has the power of a physical threat behind him without having to lift a finger. The Doctor and his masters were weird and wonderful too. I liked how they were kept mysterious. We don't learn very much about them, which makes them feel more cosmic. And that final monster, the Cyclops, was crazy. So weird, so wonderful and imaginative, and definitely horrifying. It was great. I wanted to like Ring Shout a little more than I do. I feel conflicted about it because I didn't really enjoy most of the book while I was reading. I didn't get absorbed the way I wanted to, and the book was over so quickly when I really think it could have benefited from slowing down to let its metaphor be fully explored. I liked the ending and the way Maurice progressed as a character, but I do think she doesn't have too much below her surface. The culture presented here is wonderful, and I loved all the magic in the world, both the subtle and the powerful, and the idea of a shout is something so interesting and so cool that I had never really heard of before, and I appreciated the, opportunity to broaden my horizons. I would recommend Ring Shout if you like historical fiction, body horror, and powerful women. It's a book that has a ton of theme and a ton of folklore twined together in a fast-paced novella. I gave Ring Shout 4 stars. Back to me in the studio. Bam! Bang, 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 bang.
Welcome back yet again. Oh gosh, I forgot to put the title here. As for our stats page for April, you can see that we have 5 books read and 1,142 pages read. A lot of books I read in the month of April were way shorter than average. A lot of them were under 300 pages, so it's not entirely surprising that my average page count for this month was only, the average length of the books I read this month was only 228 pages. As for the genre breakdown, I read 1 thriller, 4 horrors, 1 sci-fi, that was a sci-fi thriller, that was the one, 1 historical fiction, and 1 literary fiction. So obviously one of our horrors was historical literary. It was very complicated to classify. As for format, I read 2 audiobooks and 3 ebooks, no mistakes this time. And I got all 5 of my books this month from the library. Use your libraries, they're a great resource. If you haven't downloaded the Libby app, what are you doing? The Libby app is amazing. Do it, download Libby, I love it. I love it so much. Libby, sponsor me, please. As for our best of the month, it was Ring Shout by, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Djeli Clark. And the worst of the month was Helpmeet by Naben Ruthnum. Really wish Helpmeet was better than it was. I'm sure I said that in the review section. I heard so much good things about it, and then it was just okay. It was a shame. As far as our ratings breakdown goes, again, no 1 stars, but no 5 stars. I've had a bit of a mid couple of months when it's come to reading. I had 1 2-star book, 1 3-star book, and 3 4-star books, so a surprisingly good month. That just about wraps up my reading journal for this month. So while I send you to the outro, let's do a flip through of what I got done this month.
Thank you everybody so much for watching this video. I know it was a bit of a long one because we combined March and April, but if you've stuck it out to the end, thank you so much. Don't forget to give me a like if you liked the video, and a subscribe if you want to hear more from me. I upload infrequently. I'm sorry. I'm working on it. I'm working on a couple of big projects, so we'll get that out soon. You can follow me on all of my other social media. I'm Afterplague pretty much everywhere. That would be relevant for this video. Goodreads, Storygraph, TikTok, Threads, Twitch, and I'm after_plague on Twitter. I have a shop. I sell stickers, bookmarks, prints, coloring pages, books. I sell all sorts of stuff. That is afterplagueart.com. Again, you can check it out, afterplagueart.com. Currently, I only ship to the US, so I'm super sorry for my international viewers. I'm working on it. There's just a lot of international shipping stuff going on right now, but I'm working on it. Thank you again so much for watching, and I hope you are reading some excellent books in this post-plague world. Bye!